Good day, grade 12 learners. I hope you are doing well under the lockdown system. Today I'm basically focusing on, this is our question 5, word paper 2. So my focus is predominantly on the coming of democracy in South Africa. Look at the time frame, 1990 to 1994. Then, it is imperative that we understand that we do have guidelines at the same time. And our guidelines are as follows. We will be looking at the examination guidelines and the focuses. So our first point of reference is the debates around the process between the ANC and the National Party government. Then the stalemate in the struggle, which is the end of the Cold War, which forced the National Party and the ANC to start the negotiating process. Then we will be looking at the compromise on both sides, the need for negotiations, team efforts from both the ANC and the National Party. Then we'll be also looking at the choices made in the process coming to terms with the past also. But grade 12, it is imperative that we understand that these are the examination guidelines and the focus points that we need to focus on. But before we start, it is imperative that we understand that this is question 5 and it is with regards to paper 2. But here we are posed with a question. The topic is topic 5, the coming of democracy in South Africa. How did South Africa emerge as a democracy from the crisis of the 90s? It is imperative that we understand that during the 1990s, that South Africa had a lot of difficulty during that process. But let's first start with our introduction. Remember that we are dealing with an essay question. So every essay needs to have an introduction, content, and it needs to have a conclusion at the same time. But let's look at our introduction, how we would introduce ourselves to the coming of democracy, to the road to democracy at the same time. This topic focuses on, take note, it focuses on obstacles faced by various political organizations as they engage in negotiations for a democratic dispensation. Take note, dispensation in South Africa in the 90s. So let me repeat myself. This topic will focus on obstacles faced by various political organizations as they engage in negotiations for a democratic, take note, democratic dispensation in South Africa in the 90s. Then, our starting point is, it's imperative that we understand now, after you have written down your introduction, now you need to give us a little bit of background. We need to be familiar with the process which we call the peel method. The point, explain, example, and link it back to the point. So this would be now what we see here. This would be now our background focus, where it all culminated from. But we can see that our subheading, please remember now, it's an essay. Essays do not have subheadings. We are only putting on the subheadings. Why? To make sure that you understand what is being instructed unto you. When we look at what we have here, it says the negotiating, settlement, and government of national unity. We will be looking at the beginning of the solution, unbanning of organizations, release of political prisoners. So we are all familiar that on the 2nd of February 1990, the then president, F.W. de Klerk, had his famous speech. And by making his famous speech, he now introduced, he said that all political prisoners will be released from prison, including Nelson Mandela. Then he also unbanned all political parties. So it's imperative that we understand that these 3 points, the beginning of the solution, unbanning of organizations, release of political prisoners, that is the background information that we need to have. Then, on the 11th of February, we see this picture here, that on the 11th of February, after Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, he is seen here with his then wife, Winnie Mandela, and some other ANC comrades also. But then, now your content is starting now. Please take note. This was our background information. Background information starting with F.W. de Klerk's famous speech where he announced that all political prisoners will be released, including Nelson Mandela and all the other political prisoners, and the unbanning of political parties. Now we're moving over to the content. As you can see here, it says the start of the negotiations. It is imperative that we understand that the negotiations started not with Kodesa 1. Take note. We have highlighted here that Kodesa 1 was preceded by 3 key meetings between the South African government and the ANC to prepare the way. So, what we need to focus here is that before Kodesa 1, it was the Grote Skeer Minute, which was on the 4th of May, 1990. Important to understand that this meeting was between the National Party and the ANC. And on the 4th of May, they met at Grote Skeer. Grote Skeer is where we find the president in Cape Town. So they met in Grote Skeer, and after meeting in Grote Skeer, it was there where they decided that, listen here, we need to talk about the indemnity of those political people that are in exile and the release of political prisoners at the same time. Then, imperative that after the Grote Skeer Minute, there were violence also that was in Sebokeng, where the Inkatha hostel dwellers attacked the ANC supporters. Then, after the violence, we move over to the Pretoria Minute. Now, please take note, it's called the Pretoria Minute because it highlights the area where the agreement was signed. Then, on 6th of August, they signed the Pretoria Minute. Then, at the Pretoria Minute, this is where the ANC announced the suspension of the armed struggle, Umkhonto Sizwe. At the same time, the National Party also indicated that they will lift the state of emergency. Then we move over to the next, please take note, we are talking about preceding by 3 key meetings. The first one, Grote Skeer Minute was signed, then the Pretoria Minute, then we're talking about the National Peace Accord that was signed. Now, very important that on the 4th of September, the National Peace Accord was signed. Why did they sign the National Peace Accord? Because of the constant violence that was happening within South Africa. And because of that, they had to sign the National Peace Accord by stating that violence will cease. And at the same time, we find that the National Peace Accord was signed by representatives of 27 political organizations as well as national and homeland governments. So it's imperative that right across South Africa, they realized because of the ongoing violence in South Africa, which was threatening the negotiating process within South Africa. So they decided to sign the National Peace Accord. Now let's just go through the 3 very pertinent meetings that was initiated before Kodesa 1. The Grote Skeer Minute by the National Party and the ANC under the leadership, the National Party, the leadership was F.W. de Klerk. The ANC, the leadership leader was Nelson Mandela, where they decided to discuss and to come to terms that, listen here, we need to talk about the indemnity of the political prisoners that needs to be released and the indemnity of the political people that were in exile. Then, on 6th of August, they signed a Pretoria Minute where they, please take note, where they now decided that ANC will announce the unbanning of Umkhonto Sizwe, and the National Party decided to lift the state of emergency in South Africa. At the same time, the National Peace Accord was signed, banning all violence in South Africa. But in December 1991, 19 organizations, political organizations, met in Kempton Park, and they started the process called Kodesa. Now, when we look at the word Kodesa, it means Convention for a Democratic South Africa. The purpose of Kodesa was to establish a constitution for the new South Africa. But at Kodesa 1, we see that they were trying to discuss how to change the constitution of South Africa, but it didn't materialize to that point because they decided at Kodesa, we will only work on an interim constitution, and only after the first election we will work on a permanent constitution for the new South Africa. Then, after Kodesa 1, they signed the Declaration of Intent. Very important, learners, that you remember that at Kodesa 1, interim constitution, and they signed the Declaration of Intent. So, some people would argue, Kodesa 1, was it a success or not a success? So if you look nicely now, Kodesa 1 was a success. Then, we move over to our next slide. Our next slide, the subheading is Start of Negotiations Continued. Very important that we understand. They pledged themselves to work together to achieve greater tolerance. The police were reminded of their duty to protect the people of South Africa, irrespective of race, take note, irrespective of race, religion, political affiliation, and gender. So this was now decided when they were busy finalizing Kodesa 1. So when we move over to our next slide. So after Kodesa 1, after they decided, after the signing of the Declaration of Intent, they decided now that, listen here, we need to break up into small working groups, committees, and then we will converge on another time. But during that time, de Klerk was under immense pressure by the conservatives in South Africa. When we speak about the conservatives, we look at the word conservatives, it means people that don't want to change. Then it's imperative that we understand in the period between Kodesa 1 and Kodesa 2, in early 1992, the National Party lost 3 by-elections to the Conservative Party. And because of the loss, de Klerk was a bit in a double-minded issue. This is why de Klerk now announced a whites-only referendum to test the white people's opinion on reform and negotiations. At the same time, the result of the referendum was a landslide yes. What does it mean? It means that more than 68% of the people said yes, de Klerk. We voted yes. Why? Because we need you to continue with the negotiating process. That allowed de Klerk now to have what? To have the mandate to continue with the negotiating process. De Klerk could no longer use the excuse, take note, de Klerk could no longer use the excuse of white conservatives to procrastinate. Take note of this word, procrastinate. It means to delay in moving towards a non-racial election. Let's go to our next slide. So, after the white-only referendum, it is imperative that we understand that Kodesa 2 had now to start. So with Kodesa 2, they met again in Kempton Park. After meeting in Kempton Park, during that process, they could not reach consensus based upon the Constitution. At the same time, They could not reach consensus based upon the power sharing also of the country. But as the negotiations were continuing and as they were struggling to reach consensus, something happened in Boipatong, which we'll see on our slide. It says on the 17th June 1990, the Boipatong massacre occurred. But if we look at our slide carefully, we can see that members of Inkatha allegedly attacked. This is supposed to be ANC supporters. This is supposed to be ANC supporters. Then, as we continue, we see that because of what happened at Boipatong, Nelson Mandela accused de Klerk of instigating the violence within South Africa. And that forced now the ANC to walk out of Kodesa too. So with that in mind, what happens here is that Kodesa 2 looks like it failed. Because why? They couldn't reach consensus based upon the constitution and the power sharing within the country. At the same time, the Boipatong massacre was a sign that the National Party, they were instigating violence within South Africa. And because of that, the ANC walked out of Kodesa 2. But imperative that we understand that when the ANC walked out of Kodesa 2, what happened here? They started a program called Rolling Mass Action. Meaning that rolling mass action, they had lots of demonstrations right across South Africa. Then the violence continued right across the country. The violence continued. We can see that on 7 September 1992, a crowd of about 8,000 people gathered in Bishu to protest against the Ciskei homeland government of Brigadier Oupa. But look at what happened here. The Ciskeian troops, take note, the Ciskeian troops and the South African Defence Force opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing 28 people. So it is imperative to understand that as the violence continued, it was to derail the negotiating process within South Africa. Then, as the violence continued, the country was at the brink now of a civil war almost. Why? Because the violence was assigned to say, stop the negotiating process because you cannot bring change within the country. But look what happened here. As the violence is continuing, our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, which represented the ANC, and Rolf Meyer from the National Party, they met in secret. So when they met in secret, because they had to meet in secret, because why? The country is at the brink of a civil war, and things had to change. But what happened here is, as our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Rolf Meyer met in secret, the National Party government agreed on 3 principles. They agreed on to release more political prisoners, erect fences around migrant workers' hostels, ban the carrying of traditional weapons. Now it's imperative that now the banning of the carrying of traditional weapons, it was also discussed when they signed the National Peace Accord. Then what happened now here is that Kodesa 2 ended and the MK was disbanded. So after Kodesa 2 ended now, very important now, when Rolf Meyer met with Cyril Ramaphosa in secret, they came to a conclusion which was called the Record of Understanding. So the Record of Understanding was not signed as yet when Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa met in secret. They only came to the conclusion of the Record of Understanding, and the National Party agreed upon the 3 points that we highlighted earlier, which was release more political prisoners, erect fences around migrant workers' hostels, ban the carrying of traditional weapons. So after the ending of the record of understanding, this is what happened now. This set the platform for a multi-party negotiating process. But before we continue with the multi-party negotiating process, something significant happened. On the 10th of April 1993, Chris Hani was assassinated in front of his driveway. Please take note, grade 12s, you need to indicate who assassinated Chris Hani. Chris Hani was assassinated by Janusz Wallace, a Polish immigrant. And as he assassinated him, the neighbor drove by, and the neighbor's husband informed the police, and at the same time, this is what happened now. When he informed the police, he was arrested some kilometers away from the scene where he assassinated Chris Hani, and after he was arrested, this is what happened now. The country was in uproar. It means unrest was right through South Africa. And as the country was in uproar, the Klerk lost, during this period of the assassination of Chris Hani, very important that we understand that F.W. de Klerk lost control of South Africa. And as he lost control of South Africa, he asked Mandela to intervene. And as Mandela intervened, this is now where we see the strength and the power of Nelson Mandela, because he calmed the nation down when he appeared live on television by stating, listen here, yes, a white man killed Chris Hani, but a white witness reported the incident, meaning that as South Africans, we need to work together in order to bring change within the country in itself. Then this was very significant. This was very significant. Why was it significant to the negotiating process? Because why? Then they set an election date, 27 April 1994. So after the assassination now of Chris Hani, Joe Slovo came up with a concept, with an idea, which he suggested or he proposed, a 5-year, take note, a 5-year government of national unity. Now, grade 12, it is imperative to understand that government of national unity is written out fully, but you abbreviated GNU. It means now that the government of national unity, it will be power sharing. It means compromising the whole process. Then the government of national unity would include all parties which obtained over 5%, take note, over 5% of the vote in the democratic elections for the first 5 years. This meant that the National Party was sure to be included in this process. The term used for the National of Government Unity was classified as what? The Sunset Clause, and it was introduced by Joe Slovo. Then we move over to the next point now. So after Joe Slovo now introduced the Sunset Clause, it is imperative that we understand that violence continued within South Africa. Why did violence continue in South Africa? The main aim for the continuation of the violence was to derail the negotiating process in South Africa. The first incident of violence that we can look at is the AW invasion of World Trade Center. So when we look at why did the AWB invade the World Trade Center, this was now when the multi-party forum was in process. Why did the AW invade the World Trade Center? Very imperative that we understand that part. They wanted, the AWB wanted their own Volksstad. And that was the main reason why they invaded it. And they wanted to disrupt the negotiating process at the same time. Then we move on. At St. James's Church, we find the St. James Massacre occurred. During the Sunday evening service on 25th July 1993, a group of uplockaders attacked the St. James Church in Kenilworth using grenades and AK-47. Take note, they were using grenades and AK-47s. They killed 11 members of the congregation and wounded 58 people. Then another incident occurred, killing at the Heidelberg Tavern. An attack on the Heidelberg Tavern took place in Observatory, Cape Town in December 1993. So now we can see that this is what we call the continuation of violence. First, the AWB stormed violently. They drove in to the World Trade Center with armored vehicles, trying to disrupt and demanding a Volksstaat. Then we see that the APLA also now went to St. James Church and they killed the worshippers. But APLA again also went to the Heidelberg Tavern and killed people there. Then the final road to democracy. So the final road to democracy is, what we can clearly understand here is that not all the political role players in South Africa were happy with this process. Why were they not happy? When we look at the Bantustan, the homeland leaders, they were not happy with this process because the Bantustan homeland leaders, they realized they are about to lose what? Their control, their power, the authority that they were moving under. But the Conservative Party, which was the opposition to the National Party, they were also not happy. So what happened now is that the Conservative Party decided only 6 months before the election that they will be part of the transformation and part of the first democratic elections in South Africa. The Inkatha, on the other hand, under the leadership of Bantu Holomisa, they decided only a week before the elections that they would be part of this change within South Africa. But it is imperative that we understand that in November 1993, an interim constitution for South Africa was agreed upon. Very important. March 1994, violence again continued. The Shell House massacre. IFP members killed by ANC security forces. Now the question would come now, why were IFP members killed by ANC supporters? Because there were constant conflict within South Africa between Inkatha and the ANC supporters. And for that reason, they decided to march towards Shell House, which is in Johannesburg. Then, our next point of reference is, like I've mentioned earlier, Freedom Front and the IFP joint elections. Take note, Freedom Front, 6 months before the elections. IFP, 1 week before the elections. They joined this whole process. Then the Government of National Unity oversee a new constitution. On 27th April 1994, South Africa's first democratic elections occurred within South Africa. Now, it is important that we understand what actually occurred during this whole process. Is that after the elections, the ANC now won these elections with more than 62%. And after the ANC won this election, Nelson Mandela was elected as the first democratic president where? In South Africa. Now, grade 12, it is imperative that we understand now that as this now explains now the road to democracy. Let me just do a recap on what we need to focus on now again. Let me just go back with my slides quickly. Our introduction, please take note, we focus primarily on obstacles by various political organizations. That's the first step. Then they were engaged in different types of negotiations. Then we go to the background knowledge. Background knowledge, always important. Please take note, your background knowledge must not be more than one paragraph. One paragraph sufficient enough to give us background information. We can look here at the clerk on the 2nd of February 1990. What did the clerk do? de Klerk had his famous speech where he unbanned all political parties. At the same time, he said all political prisoners will be released from prison, including Nelson Mandela. Then we see on 11th of February, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Now, after the release of Nelson Mandela, it's important that we understand that Nelson Mandela at that point in time was the deputy of the ANC. Oliver Tambo was still the president of the ANC at that point in time. So Nelson Mandela had to move in between South Africa and Zambia, and he had to ask for advice from the leadership in Zambia also. But the official negotiation started on the 4th of May, where they signed the Groote Minute, and the purpose of the Groote Minute was to discuss the indemnity of those people that were in exile and the release of political prisoners. At the same time, there was violence. Please take note, you need to include the violence in Sebokeng. What happened in Sebokeng? Inkatha hostel dwellers attacked who? ANC supporters. Then you move over to the next point. 6 August 1990, they signed the Pretoria Minute. So after they signed the Pretoria Minute, it is imperative to understand what was the Pretoria Minute all about. The Pretoria Minute was where the ANC decided to announce that, listen here, we are stopping with Mkhonto we Sizwe, we are stopping with our armed struggle. The National Party decided, listen here, we are announcing that we are lifting the state of emergency. Then, 14 September 1991, we see that the National Peace Accord was signed. Why? Because of the ongoing violence within South Africa. Then, we find now, in December 1991, Kodesa 1 started. When Kodesa 1 started, what happened? 19 political organizations met in Kempton Park. The main aim of this was to do what? Was to discuss a way forward. What was the first point on the agenda? It was to discuss a new constitution. But what was the conclusion? The conclusion was basically, we can only get to an interim constitution, and after the first elections, what will happen? Then we will decide on a permanent constitution. Then, at Kodesa 1, they signed a declaration of intent. That's imperative that we remember that process. Then, the start of the negotiations continued now. So, grade 12 learners, it's important that we understand we are dealing with history, meaning it is not your story, but it is someone else's story. So it means your story has got a start and your story has got an end at the same time. Then, at Kodesa 1, this was pertinent, this was brought across. They pledged themselves to work together to achieve greater tolerance. Then, the police were reminded of their duty to protect the people of South Africa irrespective of race, religion, political affiliation, and gender. Very important. Why was this point brought across? Because there was a claim that Third Force was involved assisting in Inkatha people that was killing the ANC supporters. Then, when we go over to the next point, now after Kodesa 1, this is important that we understand this part. After Kodesa 1, there was a white-only referendum. Now, why a whites-only referendum? Because de Klerk lost 3 by-elections to the Conservative Party. And after losing those 3 by-elections, there was a bit of a doubt. Must he continue with the negotiating process or he must not? But take note, this referendum, de Klerk, the white people voted, more than 68% of them voted yes, meaning that he's got the mandate to continue with the negotiating process. Then, de Klerk could no longer use the white conservatives to procrastinate what? To procrastinate towards moving towards a non-racial election in South Africa. So now we see now, Kodesa 1, after Kodesa 1, whites-only referendum. After a whites-only referendum, this is now what happened now. The violence continued now. But take note, when they met in May 1992 to start with Kodesa 2, Kodesa 2 was not a smooth sail on the ship, all right? The ship was not sailing nicely on the water. So this is what happened now here with Kodesa 2. With Kodesa 2, they decided, listen here, we need to continue where we ended with Kodesa 1. But Kodesa 2 didn't went off so smoothly like Kodesa 1 actually finished off. And this is what happened now. During the negotiating process with Kodesa 2, there was a Boy Patong massacre, where again, in Kata, hostile dwellers attack ANC supporters. Then after that, it's pertinent that we understand this process. After that, after they were attacked, it is important that we understand that the ANC now, under the leadership of Mandela during this negotiating process, he now claimed that de Klerk was instigating violence in South Africa. And the ANC decided to walk out of Kodesa 2, and they introduced what? A program called Rolling Mass Action. So the violence continued in South Africa. So after the ANC walked out, they arranged with a group of people, about 80,000 people, and they gathered in Bishu to protest against Ciskei, Homeland Government of Brigadier Oupa. Then at the same time, the Ciskei police and the South African Defence Force, they opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing 28,000 people. Then our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Rolf Meyer met in secret, and the government agreed on 3 principles, which is called release more political prisoners, erect fences around migrant workers' hostels, ban the carrying of traditional weapons, and the ANC, this banned Umkhonto we Sizwe at the same time. So, as the violence continued, and at the end of Kodesa 2, where they could not reach consensus, this is what happened at the same time. Because we need to understand that after this, the establishment of the record of understanding, the record of understanding was a conclusion reached between our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Rolf Meyer at the same time. So after the conclusion of the record of understanding, this set the platform for what? A multi-party forum, which had to be held in Kempton Park again. So this is what happened now. Then, after the record of understanding, we are focusing on the assassination of Chris Hani on the 10th of April, assassinated by Janusz Walas, a Polish immigrant. At the same time, it was significant in the fact that de Klerk lost control within South Africa, and it showed that the strength and the power that Nelson Mandela had, where he calmed down the nation. At the same time, we need to understand that it was so significant that an election date had been set during this process. Then a government of national unity was proposed by Joe Slovo. Take note, this was a power-sharing compromise. At the same time, the government of national unity would include all parties which obtained over 5% of the vote in democratic elections for the first 5 years. This meant that the National Party was sure to be included in this process. The term sunset clause was used for this compromise. So the sunset clause was introduced by Joe Slovo. Then we continue, violence continued within South Africa. The AWB invaded the World Trade Center with armored vehicles. Why? The purpose primarily was they demanded a Volksstaat and they wanted to disrupt the negotiating process that was continuing in South Africa. We see that in Cape Town, APLA cadres launched an attack at the St. James Church, all right, where they used grenades and AK-47s. They killed 11 members of the congregation and wounded 58 people. At the same time, killing at the Heidelberg Tavern, an attack was launched again by who? By APLA. All right, where people also were killed during this whole process. Then the final road to democracy. It's where the Freedom Front decided 6 months before the time they will join part and be part and parcel of the elections. The IFP decided 1 week before that they will be part and parcel of this negotiating process. But what we must not forget, all political leaders were not happy, especially the homeland leaders, because they realized they are going to relinquish their power. But in November 1993, an interim constitution for South Africa was agreed upon. March 1994, the Shell House massacre, IFP members killed by ANC security forces. Take note, we need to explain why the Shell House massacre occurred. Because what happened there is that because of the constant clashes between the ANC and the Inkatha, for that reason they decided to march towards Shell House in Johannesburg. Then at the same time, the government of national unity oversee a new constitution. On 27 April 1994, South Africa's first democratic elections occurred, where the ANC won this election by more than 62%. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black president within South Africa. Grade 12s, please take note. This now concludes my presentation based upon the road to democracy. It is imperative that we understand that we need to remember our exam guidelines and our focus points. Why must we remember that? Because we need to understand there were obstacles. There were various negotiating processes that went along. There were violence. There were compromises that had to be reached. Why? So that South Africa could be a democratic country. And grade 12s, very important to understand when we write this topic, that there needs to be structure. There needs to be order when we write this essay. Remember, it is an essay. There must be introduction, there must be content, and there must be conclusion. And also very important that we understand this part. We need to understand that when we have our introduction, we have our content, which is our body, and the conclusion. We need to read our question thoroughly. Because what happened is the grade 12s are not reading the question thoroughly. Now the introduction and conclusion is vague. So when the introduction, conclusion is vague, what happens? You normally lose marks. So grade 12s, my encouragement to you is keep safe, continue to study, read through your work, and stay indoors. Thank you for listening to me.